The little town of Belford sat in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, shrouded by an air of secrecy and old superstition. Its charm, with cobblestone streets and time-worn Victorian houses, masked something darker lurking beneath the surface. For 17-year-old Clara Jensen, moving to Belford was anything but exciting. Her parents had uprooted the family for her father's new job, a position he landed with the endorsement of none other than Pastor Tobias Gray of Belford's Sanctuary of the Shepherd. This church wasn't like the ones Clara knew. There were no steeples, no stained glass windows. Instead, the church loomed on the outskirts of town, a monolithic structure of blackened stone that seemed to absorb the light. From the moment Clara entered Belford, she felt something was wrong. The townspeople stared just a little too long, their smiles a bit too wide. Her mother brushed it off, calling it small-town charm. Her father reassured her, "It's just how people are here. Give it time." But Clara couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest, like a dull throb warning her of something coming. The first day of school wasn't much better. Clara kept her head down, trying to avoid the watchful eyes of her classmates. During lunch, a girl named Meredith slid into the seat beside her. "You're new," Meredith said bluntly, brushing a strand of ash blonde hair from her face. Clara nodded. "Yeah, just moved here." Meredith tilted her head, a sly grin spreading across her lips. "You're not going to want to miss the midnight lock-in at the sanctuary this Friday. Everyone goes. It's tradition." "Thanks, but I'm not really religious," Clara replied cautiously. Meredith laughed, a sound that seemed too loud, too hollow. "Oh, honey, it's not about religion. It's about enlightenment." Clara didn't know why, but she found herself agreeing to go. Friday came, and Clara stood at the gates of the sanctuary, its blackened stone walls looming under the full moon. Groups of teens gathered around the entrance, their chatter and laughter echoing into the night. Meredith found her in the crowd, grabbing her hand and leading her inside. The interior of the sanctuary was cavernous, with vaulted ceilings and walls carved with strange symbols Clara didn't recognize. At the center of the room stood a massive altar draped in crimson cloth, its surface adorned with golden bowls and unlit candles. Pastor Gray appeared, his gaunt frame dressed in ceremonial robes. His deep-set eyes seemed to pierce Clara's soul. "Welcome, children," he began, his voice smooth like oil. "Tonight, you will take the first step toward understanding the truth of the shepherd." The lights dimmed, replaced by the flickering glow of candles. Pastor Gray continued, his voice growing more fervent with each word. "The world is chaos. The shepherd offers freedom, true freedom. But freedom comes at a price." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced at the others, expecting to see unease, but instead found rapt attention. She was the only one afraid. As the clock struck midnight, the room plunged into darkness. The air grew heavy, thick with incense that smelled of earth and decay. A deep, resonant hum filled the space, vibrating through Clara's chest. Pastor Gray's voice cut through the darkness. "Step forward, children of the flock. Embrace the shepherd's gift." One by one, the teens approached the altar, where Gray held a golden chalice filled with a thick, dark liquid. Each drank, their faces contorting in pain before relaxing into a trance-like calm. When it was Clara's turn, she hesitated. "Drink," Gray urged, his voice commanding. Clara took the chalice, the liquid's metallic scent turning her stomach. Reluctantly, she drank. It burned as it went down, sending a wave of nausea and dizziness crashing over her. The room seemed to tilt, the candlelight distorting into twisted shapes. Shadows moved on the walls, growing horns and claws. A voice echoed in her mind, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud. "You are mine." Clara woke in her bed the next morning, her memories of the night before fragmented and nightmarish. Her parents acted as if nothing was wrong, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had changed. She started seeing things, shadows that moved when no one was there, whispers that called her name in empty rooms. At school, Meredith and the others treated her differently. They smiled too much, their eyes gleaming with something feral. "You're one of us now," Meredith said cryptically. Clara began to uncover the truth about the sanctuary. It wasn't just a church. It was a cult, worshipping a being they called the Shepherd. The rituals were a means to bind its followers, body and soul, to its will. As Clara dug deeper, she found horrifying accounts of past lock-ins. Teens who went missing, families who vanished overnight. The Shepherd demanded sacrifices, and the cult was more than willing to provide. One night, Clara woke to find Meredith and a group of cult members standing at the foot of her bed. Their faces were blank, their eyes glowing faintly. "It's time," Meredith said, her voice devoid of emotion. Clara ran, bolting into the woods behind her house. The cult gave chase, their footsteps pounding like drums in the distance. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at her skin and roots tripping her feet. She stumbled into a clearing, where a massive stone altar stood. The cult surrounded her, their chanting rising in volume. Pastor Gray emerged, holding a golden dagger. "The Shepherd demands your devotion," he said, raising the blade. As Gray brought the dagger down, Clara screamed. A blinding light erupted from the woods, and the cult members froze. A figure stepped into the clearing, a woman cloaked in silver, her presence radiating power. "This one is not yours," the woman said, her voice reverberating like a bell. The Shepherd's influence shattered, and the cult members collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Clara looked at the woman, who smiled softly. "You are stronger than you know," she said before vanishing into the night. Clara left Belford the next day, her family in tow. They never spoke of the sanctuary again, but Clara carried the memories with her. She still felt the Shepherd's shadow lingering in her mind, but she also felt something else, a spark of defiance, a strength the cult could never take from her. In a new town, far from Belford, Clara found a small church with stained glass windows and a kind pastor who handed her a plush lamb with a blue bow. For the first time in years, she felt safe. But in the depths of her mind, she knew the battle was far from over. The Shepherd was still out there, waiting. The town of Blackridge was the kind of place most people drove through without stopping. Nestled deep in the forests of West Virginia, it was forgotten on the map, with its crumbling storefronts and abandoned houses. The only sign of life was the imposing Blackridge Cathedral, perched on a hill and visible from miles away. For 19-year-old Emily Carter, Blackridge was a fresh start. After losing both parents in a car accident, she'd come to live with her aunt and uncle, the town's morticians. The house was as eerie as the town itself, a sprawling Victorian mansion adjacent to the cemetery. Her first week in Blackridge was uneventful but unsettling. The townsfolk whispered in hushed tones and avoided eye contact. Strangely, they seemed particularly wary of the cathedral, crossing the street to avoid its shadow. One evening, Emily heard a knock at the door. A girl her age stood there, her smile bright and uncomfortably wide. She introduced herself as Lila, the choir director for the cathedral. Her voice was sugary sweet. "I heard you sing once at the cafe," Lila said. "You have a lovely voice. We could really use someone like you in the Blackridge choir." Emily hesitated. Singing had been her passion back home, but it felt like another life, a life before grief. Still, Lila was persistent, and Emily reluctantly agreed to attend a rehearsal. When she arrived at the cathedral, Emily was struck by its grandeur. The interior was starkly different from its decaying exterior, lavish, almost regal, with gold trim and high, vaulted ceilings. The choir members greeted her warmly, their smiles eerily similar to Lila's. They welcomed her like an old friend, though she had never met them before. Rehearsals began with normal hymns, but as the evening progressed, the songs grew stranger. The lyrics shifted from praising God to something darker. Songs about sacrifice, blood, and devotion to a crimson shepherd. The melodies were haunting, the kind that stuck in your head long after the music stopped. When it was Emily's turn to sing, she found her voice flowing effortlessly, as if the music itself was pulling the notes from her throat. The choir members beamed with approval, their eyes glowing faintly red in the dim light. As the rehearsal ended, Lila placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You have a gift," she said, her voice dripping with sincerity. "The Crimson Shepherd will be pleased." Emily tried to laugh it off. "What's the Crimson Shepherd?" Lila's smile faltered for the first time. "You'll see." Emily's unease grew with each rehearsal. The songs became more cryptic, the lyrics laced with ancient languages. The choir members seemed to change as well. Their skin grew paler, their movements more fluid. They began to avoid her outside rehearsals, but during practice, their eyes were always on her. One night, Lila invited her to a special ceremony. "It's an honor," she said. "Not everyone is chosen." Emily didn't want to go, but curiosity and a strange, unshakable pull compelled her. The ceremony was held in the cathedral's underground chamber, a cavernous room lit by hundreds of crimson candles. At the center stood a stone altar, engraved with symbols Emily didn't recognize. The choir surrounded the altar, singing a hymn so low and guttural it seemed to vibrate the walls. Lila stepped forward, holding a golden chalice filled with a dark, viscous liquid. "Drink and be bound to the Crimson Shepherd," she said, offering the chalice to Emily. Emily froze. The air grew heavy, and a deep, resonant hum filled the room. She felt her knees weaken, her vision blurring as whispers filled her ears. She didn't know what came over her, but she ran. Emily fled into the woods, her breath visible in the cold night air. But no matter how far she ran, the whispers followed, growing louder and more insistent. She stumbled upon an ancient stone pillar, covered in the same symbols as the altar. Before she could process what she was seeing, the forest went silent. The air grew frigid, and a figure emerged from the shadows, a towering creature with the body of a man but the head of a ram. Its horns twisted impossibly high, dripping with crimson fluid. Its eyes glowed like molten lava. "You cannot run, child," it said, its voice deep and otherworldly. "You have been chosen." Emily backed away, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to move, roots twisting and curling to hold her in place. The creature stepped closer, extending a clawed hand. "Sing for me," it commanded. Emily's voice came unbidden, the same haunting melody from the rehearsals pouring from her lips. The creature seemed to feed on the sound, growing taller, its eyes burning brighter. But as she sang, Emily noticed something. Its power was tied to the song. She stopped abruptly, and the creature recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. It roared in anger, the sound shaking the trees. Emily took the opportunity to flee, stumbling back to the cathedral. Inside, she found Lila and the choir waiting for her. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes glowing red. "You cannot escape the shepherd," Lila said, her voice layered with something inhuman. But Emily had an idea. She began to sing, not the hymns of the Crimson Shepherd, but a lullaby her mother used to sing. The melody was soft, pure, and filled with love. The choir screamed, their forms flickering like the creature's. The cathedral trembled, its walls cracking as the power of the Crimson Shepherd waned. Emily ran as the cathedral began to collapse, its walls crumbling inward. The choir members clawed at her, but their strength had faded. Outside, the townsfolk stood silently, watching as the cathedral was consumed by fire and ash. The Crimson Shepherd's roar echoed one last time before fading into nothingness. The townsfolk began to blink, their expressions softening as if waking from a long nightmare. Emily left Blackridge the next morning, carrying only the clothes on her back and a resolve to never look back. But as she drove away, she noticed something strange in her rearview mirror, a faint, crimson glow flickering in the distant forest. She turned the radio on to drown her thoughts. A haunting melody played, one she'd never heard before but somehow knew by heart. It followed her, a reminder that while she may have escaped, the Crimson Shepherd was still out there, waiting for another voice to sing its song. Nestled deep in the mountains of Montana, the small town of Ashwood was known for its isolation and rugged beauty. A single road twisted up the mountainside to the town, flanked by dense forests and sheer cliffs. Outsiders rarely visited, and when they did, they often remarked on the eerie silence that blanketed the town. For 20-year-old Nate Halpern, Ashwood wasn't just a town. It was a way out. He'd taken a summer job restoring the town's only landmark, the Ashwood Chapel, a dilapidated wooden church that had been abandoned for decades. It seemed like easy work. Fix a roof, clean up some pews, paint the walls. Besides, Nate needed the money to cover tuition for his final year of college. But from the moment he arrived, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The townsfolk were polite but distant, their faces pale and drawn. They all seemed to avoid the chapel, crossing the street when they passed it. "You'll want to keep your evenings free," one old man warned as Nate unpacked his tools. "The woods don't take kindly to wanderers after dark." The chapel was worse than Nate expected. The roof sagged, the windows were broken, and the air inside was damp and heavy. Carvings covered the pews and walls, intricate patterns of spirals and crosses that didn't look quite right. At first, Nate thought they were graffiti left by vandals, but the carvings were old, the wood darkened and cracked around them. The first night, Nate stayed late, determined to make progress. As the sun set, the air grew colder, and the quiet became oppressive. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, but he couldn't say why. It was then he noticed the door at the back of the chapel. Unlike the rest of the building, it was pristine, polished wood, gleaming brass handle. It was locked, but Nate found himself inexplicably drawn to it. He tried to ignore it, but as the hours dragged on, the door seemed to loom larger in his mind. When he finally gave in and pressed his ear to the wood, he thought he heard faint whispers. That night, he dreamed of the door. In the dream, it opened slowly, revealing a swirling void. A voice, deep and guttural, whispered his name. The next day, a woman arrived at the chapel. She was older, with weathered skin and piercing green eyes. She introduced herself as Clara Winthrop, a historian studying the region's folklore. "You're brave to work here," she said, her voice low. "Do you know what this place was?" Nate shook his head. "Just a church, right?" Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not exactly. The Ashwood Chapel wasn't built for God. It was built for something older." She explained that the chapel was the site of a cult known as the Hollow Gospel, which flourished in the 1800s. The cult worshipped a being they called the Whispering One, said to grant power and insight to those who followed its teachings. The congregation vanished overnight, leaving the chapel abandoned. "They say the Whispering One still calls to people," Clara warned. "Once you hear it, it's hard to resist." Nate laughed nervously, brushing off her words. But as she left, he couldn't help glancing back at the door. That evening, Nate stayed late again, unable to stop thinking about the door. He convinced himself it was just a closet, probably filled with old hymnals and dusty robes. When he finally unlocked it, the truth was far stranger. The door opened to reveal a narrow staircase, spiraling downward into the earth. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of decay. Against his better judgment, Nate descended, flashlight in hand. At the bottom of the stairs was a vast underground chamber. The walls were lined with more carvings, but these were more grotesque, twisting figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. At the center of the room stood an altar, surrounded by crumbling pews. A single book lay open on the altar, its pages filled with jagged handwriting in a language Nate didn't recognize. As he stepped closer, the whispers began again. This time, they were louder, more insistent. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but somehow he knew they were addressing him. The air grew heavy, pressing against his chest. When he reached the altar, he saw his name scrawled across the open page, written in what looked like dried blood. The whispers followed Nate home that night, growing louder as he tried to sleep. Shadows flickered on the walls, twisting into impossible shapes. He heard footsteps in the hall, but when he checked, no one was there. The next day, Clara returned, looking more frantic than before. "You opened the door, didn't you?" she demanded. Nate didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Clara's face darkened. "The Hollow Gospel isn't just a story," she said. "They're still here. The Whispering One has them, trapped between worlds. And now it has its eyes on you." That night, Nate returned to the chapel, determined to end whatever was happening. He descended the staircase, flashlight trembling in his hand. The whispers grew deafening, the air thick with the smell of earth and rot. The altar was different now. Candles flickered around it, their flames unnaturally still. The book lay open, its pages glowing faintly, and standing behind the altar were shadowy figures, their hollow eyes fixed on Nate. The Whispering One spoke, its voice resonating through the chamber. "Read the words. Join the choir." Nate felt an overwhelming urge to obey, his hand reaching for the book. But Clara's voice echoed in his mind, "Resist." He grabbed the book and threw it into one of the flames. The shadowy figures screamed, their forms writhing as the fire consumed the pages. The chamber began to collapse, the walls cracking and the ceiling crumbling. Nate ran, the ground shaking beneath his feet. He barely made it out before the chapel caved in, leaving nothing but rubble behind. Nate left Ashwood the next day, vowing never to return. But the whispers never truly stopped. Late at night, when the world was quiet, he could still hear them faintly, calling his name. Some nights, he wondered if he'd truly escaped. Other nights, he was sure he hadn't.
Thanks for listening to today's story. Let us know what you think. If you want to hear more scary stories, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode when we upload it. We'll always be here and welcome you.